Anytime NFL games are being played, people are going to overreact and move players up and down their draft board based on what they're seeing. So since the preseason is finally over and these players are settling into their new draft spots, there are good buy low and sell high opportunities that are opening themselves up, and we're going through the sell highs today. And of course, I'm giving away free FFN hats, and the way to qualify to have a chance to get one is to go down there, drop a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, and give me your favorite sleeper wide receiver to take in 2024. So the first guy that I want to talk about is Devonte Adams right now. So his ADP on ESPN is 27.4 overall. And really, this is a question that I've had with Devonte Adams ever since the quarterback situation was never really ironed out there. So what they did in the offseason when they had the ability to maybe go sign a Kirk Cousins before the Atlanta Falcons tampered with Kirk Cousins is they ended up going to get Christian Wilkins, who I believe is a great addition to their defense. And one of the reasons I love the Las Vegas Raiders defense this year, but their quarterback situation is just not very good. So they obviously have Gardner Minshew, who is placed to be the starter right now. And at some point, if he doesn't do well, it's going to be Aiden O'Connell. Well, you know who's unhappy with this? Devonte Adams is unhappy with this. And he's been telling us literally on air, let's go get Tom Brady. Let's go get somebody else to be my quarterback because I do not want to play with this type of situation at quarterback here. And who could blame him, right? This is obviously some of the last couple of years that Devonte Adams is going to be a legitimate player in fantasy football. Well, then that got me wondering here. So I did some research earlier in the offseason about wide receivers who have had top 12 seasons in a consecutive several years. So essentially what we're doing here is we're studying some of the more elite wide receivers over the last 10 years or so. And you can see on the screen here everything that I took. I was trying to find what the commonalities were between these guys and what the year was when their run began in top 12 territory and what year it was that the run ended and if they ever became a top 12 guy again in fantasy football. Now, the best consecutive runs over the last 10 years is Antonio Brown and Julio Jones. They both had 6 consecutive years inside the top 12 status. Well, then when we're looking at someone like Devonte Adams, he's had 4 straight top 12 runs, but what's important to remember here is that Devonte Adams actually had 2 additional seasons before he started going on a run of a top 12 finish. So that puts his total at 6 total top 12 seasons as a fantasy football wide receiver. Now, the average number of seasons that these guys saw in consecutive top 12 status was 3 years, and the average age when these guys started to fall off was about 27.1 years old. So obviously Devonte Adams is going to be 32 years old in November. So I wanted to find essentially what happened the year before they fell off the cliff and they became bad fantasy football players. And really what you can see with a lot of these guys is that the bottom section of these guys actually didn't play a lot of that season, so they ended up having a really, really bad tumble and then never really recovered from that tumble that they had from the injury. But the top 3 guys, Demaryius Thomas, RIP, Doug Baldwin, and Allen Robinson, all those guys played a full season, and Allen Robinson was the only one who took a massive, massive tumble. So essentially what we saw last year from Devonte Adams, in my opinion, was maybe the start of the fall here, and maybe he did reach his cliff. Now, I want to be very clear. I have always liked Devonte Adams. He's been one of my favorite receivers to watch over the last 10 years or so. But when we're looking at the players here, he's had 6 top 12 seasons, and he had 4 consecutive, and he's on his current run right now. So how likely is it going to be that he's going to get 7 and extend his run to 5 when he's going to be 32 years old in November with that pairing of quarterbacks here? I just don't believe in this right here. And really, this is something that Underdog, the drafters on Underdog have kind of figured this one out. He's like the wide receiver 16 over on Underdog. Well, in ESPN, his ADP and his wide receiver ranking, it's still top 12. So he's going above guys like Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, Michael Pittman Jr., Mike Evans, Jalen Hurts, James Cook, Sam Laporta, Drake London, and Nico Collins. Like, these are guys, especially with Drake London and Nico Collins, I'd rather personally take the shot on the younger guys who have better quarterback situations than Devonte Adams does. So if I was in this situation personally, I would try to pair up Devonte Adams and maybe a lower level running back and try to get someone like a Nico Collins or Drake London and get maybe a higher end running back if you can persuade them on that price right there, because I just think that Devonte Adams' price is pretty inflated right now, and it really is because of name value in my opinion. Now, the next guy that I want to talk about here is someone that I've loved, very similar to Devonte. I love this guy, and it really hurts to put him on this list because he's still in the prime of his career. But Joe Burrow right now on ESPN and in redraft leagues in particular, It's just going too high for me, man. He's going 57.9 on ADP on ESPN, and really, it's not that drafting him in the 5th or 6th round is a massive problem. It's the quarterbacks that he's going ahead of right now. So he's going ahead of guys like Dak Prescott, who I could agree with. I think he will be better than Dak, especially if he's fully healthy this year. But I really can't get on board with Jordan Love and Kyler Murray going a considerable amount behind him, several rounds behind him. So if everything hits, right, and he's got all his weapons and he stays healthy for a full season, Joe Burrow, 100%, with no question from me, is a guy that gets you 40 points in a 4-point passing touchdown format. So imagine what he could do in a 6-point passing touchdown format. I'm totally on board with this, and I totally understand the logic behind taking Joe Burrow at the quarterback position. He's got great weapons, and he's obviously an elite player who's just gotten screwed with injuries here. Here's the problem that I have with his particular injury. So earlier in the offseason, I was really curious about Joe Burrow's injury because I remember when he went down last season, towards the end of the year, he went down to a wrist injury that I never really fully understood, and that's because it's a very, very rare injury. So what I found out is that his ligament tear in his wrist was so rare that the volume of surgeries that orthopedic surgeons do on this particular injury just isn't as much as an ACL tear or an MCL tear or something of that nature. So when we're talking about normal surgeries like an ACL tear or an MCL tear, those have a rate of 90 to 95% success rates according to an orthopedic surgeon. Now, when you're looking at his particular injury, the scapholonate, ligament repair surgery, whatever, I'm not a doctor here, but reading from a doctor, 75 to 80% success rate afterwards. On the surface level, it's still a high enough number to where it's maybe not cause for too much concern. That much matters though, 10 to 15% here, that definitely does matter when we're talking about getting a player who was elite and maybe struggling this year. And the other part was he went on to go on to say basically that his real test is when he's going to start getting into real season games. And number one, the amount of volume that he's going to be throwing. And let's say if he plays on a Monday night and then goes and plays on a Sunday night next week, or maybe a Sunday night and then goes and plays on a Thursday night the next week. With those short turnarounds, he's going to be feeling it according to this orthopedic surgeon, and it's going to be a mental battle that he's going to have to get through. I think the dude's mentally tough, but this is a problem here because this is a chronic pain issue that he will deal with, and especially when he starts getting hit. How is he going to respond to this, and will he potentially get re-injured again? So with the quarterbacks that are going behind him, I would personally just rather not take the risk on Joe Burrow this early in an ESPN draft or a sleeper draft or a Yahoo draft, wherever you're going. And I would rather just go ahead, trade back, go get some guys like Kyler Murray or Jordan Love. And instead of, spending 3 rounds prior draft pick on Joe Burrow, go get another wide receiver that you could get to fill in for a flex spot in addition to Kyler Murray and Jordan Love. That's just the move that I would prefer to do in that situation. Now, the next guy on here, I've gotten so much flack for this offseason, and I've lightened up a little bit because I like his price on Underdog a little bit better these days, but his price never really dropped in regular redraft leagues. Saquon Barkley is still going simply just too high for me. Now, I want to 100% address this right out of the gate. When we're talking about trading Saquon Barkley away, it is not lost on me that I am discussing trading a first-round draft pick in 12-team leagues, in 14-team leagues. I'm totally aware of this notion right here that I am telling you to trade away a first-round draft pick in fantasy football drafts right now. So with Saquon Barkley, what I noticed as soon as he went to the Philadelphia Eagles early in the offseason, when he got signed there in free agency, there was a massive honeymoon period for fantasy football content creators and people who just wanted to see him do so well in a new environment right here. I personally never got on board with the honeymoon phase with Saquon Barkley, and some people stayed in it. Some people clearly are still in this honeymoon phase, and a lot of people did understand once we actually went through some of the issues that he's a problem. And this is a video, I did an entire video on Saquon Barkley early in the offseason, got so much flack for it. So we're going to break down a little bit of what I studied in that video. So over the last several years, I wanted to gather information on running backs and how they performed in fantasy football and what the volume was like with running quarterbacks who had a 500 plus rushing yard season themselves. Because obviously, naturally you would think, well, if quarterback's getting that many yards rushing, the running back is not going to have that much upside. And that is absolutely true in every study that I found. Basically, guys who were getting like 14 points, 12 points, 16 points, they were on the higher end of running backs with running quarterbacks in fantasy football. Now, ironically, Saquon Barkley was the leading scorer when Daniel Jones rushed for over 500 yards in 2022. But he's not a New York Giant anymore, so let's look at the guys who Jalen Hurts has had over the last 2 years. So obviously, it was DeAndre Swift last year, and it was Miles Sanders last year. So with DeAndre Swift, he was a guy who was getting pretty good efficiency. He had an okay rushing touchdown number. That's about average. When you're talking about rushing quarterbacks, getting 5 touchdowns on the ground, that's about average. Oh, a little over 3 targets per game. So again, not bad numbers, but his fantasy points per game was 11.2. I'm not saying that he's a better player than Saquon Barkley, but I'm going to get into my issue with this in a minute. And then with someone like Miles Sanders, who averaged 12.2 fantasy points per game the previous year, he had 11 rushing touchdowns, great efficiency, but he had a bad targets per game metric here. So essentially what we're seeing is this. From the guys who did really well out of this list, they needed 2 out of the 3 things. They needed to be either super efficient, they needed to be either extreme rushing touchdown monsters, or they also needed to have targets per game that were above average here. You need to have 2 of those 3 things. I don't believe that he's going to get 2 out of the 3. What I think he will be is pretty efficient. I think he will be efficient with this offensive line and with this offensive situation. I don't believe that the rushing touchdowns is going to be higher than it always has been, because when you look at the Philadelphia Eagles, and this is something that I got into arguments about early in the offseason, people have come around to it because everybody understands that the success rate of the tush push in Philadelphia is so ridiculously high at 92.5%. What on earth would any good team look at that and say, we're not going to use this anymore? The Eagles are going to use the tush push because it frigging works. That's just the reality of NFL football. They're going to do what works. So what he's going to need, if he's going to get that efficiency, is he's going to need to get the targets per game up. And based on the running backs that they have in that backfield with Kenneth Gainwell and Will Shipley, guess what? They're both like receiving backs in that backfield. So I have a really hard time believing that Saquon Barkley monopolizes the running back, the running back reception work out of this backfield. So I'm just looking at him, and he's 10th ranked player on ESPN, but I'm looking at other running backs behind him. Jahmyr Gibbs is an easy pick for me over Saquon Barkley. Kyron Williams I would take as well. Isaiah Pacheco's kind of on that edge, teetering. Derrick Henry's the guy that I probably would take over him. So my point being that these are guys that you're getting like mid-second round. This is a situation where I would trade Saquon Barkley because of the name value and because of his value in these drafts. Get one of those running backs and then get another good wide receiver on top of it. And like I said, when you actually look at Saquon Barkley's price on an underdog, he's going basically towards the end of the second round. This is not an unreasonable price right here. So if you do want to draft Saquon Barkley, but don't want to take him at that first round capital anymore, you can join Underdog today using code FFN, where not only will they match your deposit by 50%, but you will also be able to take advantage of this basically free line right here on Travis Kelce getting 0.5 yards in week 1 versus the Baltimore Ravens. That's the easiest pick of all time, obviously. And they'll also give you up to $1,000 in bonus cash at that 50% match. So if you want to do it today, join Underdog using code FFN. Now, the next guy that I want to go through here, I don't get this one. I don't know why he's this high. I try to understand a little bit with Ramondre Stevenson, though. I just can't get on board with his draft price. His draft price right now on ESPN is 63.2 overall. So with Ramondre Stevenson, I think that the one thing that I've seen the most from people who were in on Ramondre this year is that obviously volume is king in fantasy football. He is going to monopolize the backfield. They just signed the dude to a big extension, yada, yada, yada. Listen, I'm not here to discount that fantasy football is ruled by volume. That's obviously a part of fantasy football, and that's not just a part. It's a massive part of fantasy football. But what happens with the volume is on a bad team at the running back position. Not good things historically. So over the last 2 years, what you'll see on the screen right here is running backs on bad teams, specifically bottom 5 teams, and how they finished in a half PPR format in their particular year. What you'll see here is the only running back in the last 2 years, in the last 10 offenses, that finished inside of the top 20 was James Conner when he finishes the running back 20. He finishes running back 18 just last year. That's your ceiling that you're looking at here for a bottom 5 team or a bottom 5 offense. Ramondre Stevenson's ceiling is not very high. It's sort of like when people discuss Najee Harris and the potential that he may monopolize the backfield without Jaylen Warren. Well, that's a different story, but the reality is that the upside is just not very high with these bad offenses. And I'm sorry, Patriots fans, but the Patriots are going to be, if not the worst, one of the worst teams in the league. So we're drafting Ramondre Stevenson basically at his ceiling right here. He's the running back 19 off the board in ESPN drafts. And when I'm looking at DeAndre Swift, as much as I don't really like him, he's not being drafted at his ceiling. David Montgomery is not being drafted at his ceiling. James Conner, Brian Robinson, those guys are not being drafted at their ceiling. And Raheem Mostert certainly is not being drafted at his ceiling. So again, trading back and just getting one of those guys instead is just the ideal move here because you're trying to maximize ceiling. And with Zamir White's offense and with Ramondre Stevenson's offense, he simply just does not have that opportunity to do that. So let me know what you think of the guys in the comments below. And if you want to see who the buy low candidates are before week 1, click on this video right here.